will present his ongoing work, and the title of the work is What Lowered Inflation in India, Monetary Policy or Commodity Prices. And work is a joint work with Pulappare Balakrishnan. Okay, so Dr. Parameswaran.
Thank you, Chandran. Uh, yeah, this has Chandran already told, this is a joint work with Professor Pulappa Balakrishnan, and he told that he would join the seminar. The title is essentially what lowered inflation in India is monetary policy or commodity prices. Here, the context of the paper is essentially the change in the monetary policy regime from 2016 onwards. India also joined the League of Central Banks, adopting inflation targeting as the policy for taming inflation. And for that, 2015, Indian Parliament amended the RBI Act to make inflation control as the sole objective of monetary policy. The amendment mandated RBI to target inflation measured in terms of consumer price index. The target is at 4% with a plus or minus 2 tolerance band. And initially, it was for a period of 5 years from 2016 to the March 31, 2021. And with that, RBI became one of the central bank adopting inflation targeting as a policy officially. And as per the original terms of agreement between Government of India and RBI, the policy of inflation targeting was reviewed after 5 years, and the mandate was given to and the policy was renewed from April 1 to 2021 onwards. Our prior to this official verdict, a number of academic evaluations of the ultimate inflation targeting regime appeared, and it also came in a financial press. But these academic evaluations generally concluded that it had succeeded, and it had succeeded by anchoring inflation expectations by the central bank. So in this paper, we investigate this claim, whether central bank actually controlled inflation during the inflation targeting regime, and whether it actually anchored inflation expectations, and whether expectations have a significant impact on the trajectory of inflation in India. Why we are examining this issue is that, in our view, is that a claim that inflation targeting has succeeded, it is necessary to first establish that the central bank has actually controlled inflation. This would require demonstrating that inflation model on which the policy of inflation targeting is based is empirically valid. Secondly, it would also be necessary to show that the instrument that the central bank uses has had traction in the way it is expected to do. Otherwise, we commit an error due to observational equivalence. That is, inflation may have been generated by a process unrelated to inflation targeting strategy and its underlying model. In the evaluations claiming the success of inflation targeting India have not been accompanied by either of these exercises. In their absence, there would be no basis for the claim that it is inflation targeting that is responsible for the observed path of inflation in India since 2016. In this paper, apart from investigating the claimed effectiveness of inflation targeting in India, we also provide an explanation for the observed trajectory of inflation during the inflation targeting regime. Now, since our task is essentially to explain the trajectory of inflation in India, let us see first the trajectory of inflation in India. We plot the CPI inflation measured on the basis of the consumer price index from 2001 onwards up to 2021 quarter four. This is the latest period of data were available when we started this work. And this vertical line at 2016-17 Q2 is the indicate the beginning of the inflation targeting regime, and these two dashed horizontal lines indicate the upper bound and lower bound of the inflation targeting regime. So the RBI was mandated to keep the inflation rate within this band. Now, what we can see is that there are there are some from some of the inferences we can talk from this graph is that inflation has been lowered very significantly in India from a high of close to 15% in around 2009. Quarterly inflation hit a low of 2% in 2017. What is reported here is the quarterly inflation, the inflation rate of this quarter over the same quarter in the previous year. So it is actually annual inflation measured on a quarter by quarter to quarter basis. Secondly, since in 2016, quarterly inflation rate has remained within the prescribed band for a significant period. However, it begins to rise about 3 years into the experiment in September 2019. Here, it is important to note that this happened before the COVID pandemic induced lockdown, and therefore this increase in the CPI inflation cannot be attributed to the supply disruption due to the lockdown. And another important point to note is that even if it is said that inflation has remained within the band for such a time, inflation targeting has adopted. It entered the prescribed band some 7 quarters prior to the 2016, having been on a downward trend for at least for 1 year. So this should also alert us to the possibility that factors other than inflation targeting may have been responsible for taming inflation in India. So that secondly, another important point is that for in the initial years, you can see that inflation rate was within this band for a long period of time, from around 2000 up to 2006, around up to 2007. So this is the trend trajectory of inflation in India. Then now coming to the components of inflation, usually CPI inflation is CPI inflation is called the headline inflation, and then it has two parts. It's a core inflation. Core inflation is the inflation rate devoid of food and fuel prices, so which are considered to be volatile, and therefore usually it is not included in the core inflation. So and then so we present here these three parts. What we can see is that consumer price index inflation is continuously decreasing up to 1920, and food and beverages inflation is also declining continuously up to 2018-19, and core inflation is also following the same path, almost same path. So this is now. So it is possible that usually in the international circles, when we talk about the inflation targeting, the core inflation is considered as the target variable. But in India, core is RBI adopted consumer price index as the target. And now here, what the important point is that though core inflation is declining, it is possible that it may not be autonomous. It may also be influenced by the prices of food and beverages, as because price and of food and beverages plays an important role in determining the cost component in the manufacturing and services. So it's possible that in the trend of the core inflation may be due to is induced by the trend in the food and beverages. Now, so this is the structural pattern of inflation in India for some time. And now we will come to the underlying theoretical literature of inflation targeting. Theoretical basis of inflation targeting is the new Keynesian Phillips curve, which postulates an inflation generating and a propagating mechanism. In NKPC, inflation is generated whenever aggregate output in the economy exceeds its potential or natural level. That is, it happens when the economy is overeating. So when the economy is producing more than its potential, what happens is that demand for unemployment rate will be very low, and wage rate will be, demand for labor is very high, and wage rate will start increasing, and this will fuel the inflation. So that is the idea here. So now And then it is in the propagation mechanism in this is through inflation expectations. How inflation expectations propagate inflation is that suppose this period agents expects that next period the inflation rate will be higher. It is assumed that incorporate these expectations into their wage bargaining, and that will settle at a higher wage, which ensures a constant real wage in the next period. So this expectations itself can contribute to higher wage rate and higher cost in the next period. So this is the propagation mechanism. And inflation targeting strategy aims to control both the generation of inflation and its propagation. So in inflation targeting strategy, the central bank is expected to tame inflation by appropriately adjusting the interest rate over which it has control, so that the gap between actual output and its potential level is eliminated. And secondly, by committing itself to an inflation target and communicating it to the agents, the central bank aims to anchor their inflation expectations and thereby stop the propagation of inflation. Here, the idea is that central bank, by its credibility and its if it is committed to a particular level of inflation, and since believes that because of the credibility of the central bank, that is this, the inflation rate is this, so they moderate their inflation expectations, keeping the central bank's commitment. So that is how central bank anchor inflation expectations. However, the recent literature strongly doubt the relevance of inflation expectations in deciding the trajectory of actual inflation. For example, there is a very recent paper by he is actually working in the Federal Reserves, and he gives a lot of theoretical as well as empirical reasons to establish that inflation expectation does not matter in determining inflation, actual inflation. So that, and there are other writer, literature, other papers also came in this tradition, doubting the relevance of inflation expectations. So anyway, we will see whether inflation expectations matters in India also. Now, going to the details of the New Keynesian Phillips curve, Farrar et al. Referred to a canonical version of the NKPC, where inflation rate in period T is a function of the expected inflation of the next period, that is the agent's expectation at time t of inflation in t plus 1 period. So next period inflation rate, and then it is also a function of the output gap. And so these two are positively affect the inflation. Then output is here, output gap is the deviation of actual output from its natural level, the level associated with the natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, therefore, usually in the literature, it is called the output gap model of inflation. In this paper, we also denote it in the same way, output gap model of inflation. Henceforth, we call it output gap model. Now, later, the attempts have been made to give micro foundations to the new Keynesian Phillips curve. For instance, Garley and Gertler 1999 presented a micro-founded NKPC that is amenable to econometric estimation. They work with a market of monopolistically competitive firms that set prices as a fixed markup over marginal cost. The notable features of their model are price rigidity and rational expectations. Each period, only a random fraction theta of the firms reset their prices, and while 1 minus theta of firms keep their prices unchanged. So this is the way they are starting. And now, and then the aggregate price, then they're deriving the implications of this behavior on the aggregate price level. In the aggregate price level, in the Gadley-Gertler model evolves as a convex combination of the lagged price level and the optimal reset price P star. And Gallia-Cutler derives an equation, inflation equation from this behavior, where inflation at time point t is a function of the marginal cost at time point t, and agents inflation expectations, expectation of inflation for the next period. So this is the basic Gallian-Cutler model. And then here, estimating this model requires a measure of the real marginal cost, but which is not observable. So the author suggests two possible routes. In the first place, what they did is that they specify marginal cost is equal to kxt, where x is the output gap and k is the output elasticity of real marginal cost. The relationship can be now rewritten as pi t is equal to kxt, where xt is the output gap. We just followed the Gallian-Cutler notation. And then uh, now this inflation equation is in terms of output gap. The original model derived by Gallian-Butler expectations are forward-looking, and therefore there is no intrinsic inertia to inflation. That is, inflations are not backward-looking. That is, last year inflation has no role in this year's inflation. However, motivated by the discovery of inertia in practice, Gallian-Cutler augmented their NKPC by allowing a subset of firms to use a backward-looking rule of thumb to set prices. The resulting model specified include not only the expected inflation but also the lagged inflation along with the output gap. So this model, they call it hybrid new Keynesian Phillips curve. So this is the model they are estimating. Now, second route they are suggesting to estimate the model is to assume a Cobb-Douglas production technology, which this Cobb-Douglas production technology implies that real marginal cost is the ratio of the share of labor in output to the elasticity of output with respect to labor. So that is a real marginal cost is equal to share of labor in output to the elasticity of output, the ratio elasticity of output with respect to labor. Now replacing the expert. Now here we assume that elasticity of output to output of labor with respect to
Anil,
hello. Yeah. Now, if we assume that elasticity of output with respect to labor is constant, we can consider inflation as a function. Inflation, we can replace the the output gap with the labor share in output. So this is the second way to estimate the output gap model. Now, what we do in this paper is that we use all these methods to estimate the new Keynesian Phillips curve Indian context. We estimate output gap model using quarterly data for the period 96-97 to 2016-17 quarter one. Why 96-97? Because that is the year from which quarterly data were available in India, quarterly GDP series. And we stop here 2016-17 quarter one because our strategy is essentially to estimate the model for the pre-inflation targeting regime, and if the model is found valid, use the model to predict trajectory of inflation during the inflation targeting regime. And we use the consumer pricing, the inflation rate measured on the basis of the consumer price index. We use from 2011-12, we use the combined consumer price index. Before 2011-12, we use the combined weighted consumer price index for industrial workers and agricultural workers, because before 2011-12 we don't have a single combined consumer price index. So now what we do is that we tested the variables for stationarity and seasonal stability, and they were found to be stationary and seasonally stable. Now we use two alternative measures of output gap. The first measure is estimated using the Hartree-Prescott filter, as HP filter has been subjected to many criticism. For example, James Hamilton has a paper with the title "Why You Should Never Use the Rodriguez-Pascal Filter." So we also use a deviation of the log of actual output from its trend value when a linear trend of the price is fitted. That is, we call it deviation from the trend. We call it DT in our specification. Now, in the model, it's quite possible that that is in output gap and expected inflation are potentially endogenous, and therefore OLS estimates manage to inconsistent estimates. So we use both OLS and GMM IV instrumental variable methods for estimation, and we use lagged values of the endogenous variables as instruments. We use second, fourth, and sixth lags of the output gap, because when we look at the lagged correlation structure, these lags was found to be highly correlated, so that we, with minimum number of instruments, we can get a reason of, we can estimate. If we put too many instruments, it ultimately the estimates will converge to what is called the OLS estimates. So we use only second, fourth, and sixth lags as instruments. Now, this is the estimated. This is the NKPC and estimated results. And what you can see is that in the model, output gap HP, output gap H is the hot rate Pascal filter, and output gap DT is the deviation.
Video വേണ്ടല്ലോ വേണോ
DT.
അപ്പൊ എനിക്ക് അയാളെ കാണാം. Sorry.
So DT. So now the issue.
Okay. ഇപ്പൊ എനിക്ക് അയാളെ കാണാണ്ട്.
Okay. So the we also use oil price growth control. We also control for the oil price growth. That is. Now, what we can see is that the output gap is not significant in any of the regressions. So lagged in, so and that is, so it is not a, so output gap model is not a significant in explaining the what is called in trajectory inflation in there. And you can also see that the adjusted R square is also not very high, always less than 0.5. And then Q1, Q2, and Q3 are the quarterly dummies to control for the seasonality, quarterly effect. So now these are the GMM estimates. These are the OLS estimates, and then we again the GMM estimates are there. In GMM estimates also, lagged inflation is significant, and forward inflation is also significant, but output gap is not. Both measures of output gap are not significant at all. And oil price is also significant in determining inflation. But here the important point is that lagged inflation is not only significant, and the coefficient is also very high compared to the oil price. Oil price, in most cases, just 1/10 of the size of the coefficient of lagged. Oil price coefficient is around 1/10 of the size of the coefficient of the lagged inflation. Now we also estimate the this Phillips curve with the labor share as a measure to measure the output gap. Here we change the we use the annual data. Why we are using annual data is that labor share we have collected from the CSO publication. Factor shares in national income, public, which is the data which is available only in annually, and which is also available from 1980-81 onwards and to 2015-16. So, and the inflation rate we are using is the GDP deflator. So, and here also we use OLS as well as GMM IV. In both, it is the results are almost same as the in lagged inflation, and the forward inflation is significant in OLS but not significant in GMM, and labor share is not significant in any of the estimates. So now what happened is that now we have used quarterly data, annual data, and different measures of output gap and different estimation methods. In none of these cases, the output gap is not significant. So we conclude that the output gap model is not a output gap model is not a good descriptor of inflation in India. The absence of empirical validity of output gap model for Indian data is in line with the findings of other researchers. For example, Binu Prakash and Hadakar et al. They also found that output gap model is not a good descriptor of inflation in India, and it is also not reflecting a developing country pathology, as output gap model is not validated for the US economy, and this is the one case. But however, the recent literature also says that Phillips curve is not now is not a good inflation cannot be predicted using the Phillips curve. So, and for the Hood paper also, the recent Hood paper also give the same conclusion. So now coming to the, we have used headline inflation as our measure of inflation. However, output gap model has been validated for India using core inflation as the measure. For example, Balchari and Misra. Here we have two comments. One is India's central bank targets headline inflation. So we use headline inflation. We have to use headline inflation to evaluate inflation targeting. That's the second thing is that in our own paper, we found that we have a core inflation is related to agricultural price inflation, which are part of the headline inflation. So this association implies that core inflation has no autonomous status, and RBI cannot control it without first stabilizing food price or agricultural price inflation. Now coming to this, the research implies that now we don't have an explanation for the trajectory of inflation in India. So we now go for an alternative model of inflation in India, which is this alternative model is a part of the larger literature which is called structuralist macroeconomics, the structure of the economy and behavioral pattern. Behavior pattern which is specific to the developing countries matters in deciding the outcome. So in these structuralist models, both output and structuralist model, macroeconomics models, both output and inflation. And this model is able to generate outcomes that are observed in India, which cannot be explained by the Phillips curve. Which are these outcomes? These outcomes are the disinflationary expansions, that is booms, which are not inflationary, as well as inflationary recessions. So these are something not possible in the Phillips curve, but in the structuralist macroeconomics, this is possible. And these results are coming from the presence of an agricultural sector in the model, and this model we demonstrate in the paper which we published in this year Journal of Quantitative Economics. So now, in structuralist macroeconomics, the economy is modeled as having two sectors, agriculture and industry, with the price and output determination mechanism varying between the two. The agricultural price clears the market in each period. That is, the agricultural price is determined by the supply and demand, while the industrial price is cost determined with a fixed markup. So so here I think you might be able to, the structure matters. There are two sectors, and the behavioral assumptions vary between these two sectors. Then the output of agriculture is considered to be exogenous, as it depends upon the weather and season, while industrial output is demand determined. So these are the assumptions. These are the premises we have start with the structuralist model. Now, industrial costs are made up of labor and material cost, notably price of imported oil. The price of oil is determined in the global market, while the wage is related to the general price level, though with a lag. Here, the assumption is that the wage the nominal wage is indexed with the last period's inflation. So to maintain a constant real wage. In our own paper, we present the model of inflation in structuralist tradition, in which inflation is positively related to the relative price of agricultural good, theta. Industrial cost, cost is determined by the wage and the what is called the price of raw materials, and particularly imported raw materials, and lagged inflation. And this is the model finally we are deriving, and we use this model to specify an econometric model of inflation in structuralist tradition. So in this model, using comparative statistics, it can be shown that we have shown in our paper published this year that a rise in inflation rate can occur from either an expansion of the industry or a decline in agriculture output. This feature has the implication that we can make no definite judgment about the level of activity, in particular whether the actual output exceeds the natural level or by observing the change in inflation rate. So it is possible that inflation can happen in an economy which is also not booming. So now we estimate the structuralist model of inflation for India using quarterly data and over the same sample period as in the case of output gap model. Now, as the relative price theta was found to be non-stationary, its log difference was used. It may be here, we can derive the structuralist model in different ways. For example, Canavas 1982 presents a structuralist model in which inflation is a function of the growth rate of relative price of agricultural goods. So, when we use the growth rate, we are not deviating, we are not making any big difference to the theoretical model. Second thing is that as the growth rate of relative price can be potentially endogenous in the econometric model. The model has been estimated using both OLS and GMMIB. The instrument used are second to sixth lags of this variable, each of which were found to be correlated with the current value. So we instrument the relative price using second to sixth lags, and before choosing the lag length, we set the lag correlation structure and took only those which are highly correlated with the current values. Now, this is the estimates of the structuralist model of inflation, and here you can see that relative price is significant in both OLS and GMM, and also look at the coefficient of the relative price. For example, in GMM context, it is 0.4. It means that a 1 percentage point increase in the relative price of agricultural good leads to a 0.4 percentage point increase in the inflation rate. And oil price is also contributing to inflation, but the effect is not very. But inflation. Oil price contribution to inflation is not very high. I think around 1/10 of the, nearly to 1/10 of the importance of relative price. And another importance is lagged inflation. Lagged inflation is also contributing to the current inflation. And for example, in GMM, it is a 1 percentage point increase in the lagged inflation leads to 0.37 percentage to current inflation. So, and now that you can see that relative price, if this year's relative price is increasing, and this year's relative price increase to contribute to this year's inflation, as well as through its lagged impact of inflation or to contribute to next year's inflation also. So the relative price is getting a higher, greater impact on inflation in this. The estimate shows that. So now, so this is the, yeah. Now, so what we have found is that, and now another thing is that you also look at the fit of the model. The fit of the model is the OLS is R square is 0.624 and GMM is 0.63. It is reasonable. It is for a quarterly data, quarterly time series, R square of greater than 3.5 is something reasonably good, and it means that the model captures the trajectory reasonably well. Now coming to the on the basis of econometric evidence for the two alternative models of inflation in Indian context, now we can conclude that stable inflation since the adoption of inflation targeting in 2016 is opposed to the behavior of relative prices and the price of imported oil. To further establish this view, We use the OLS estimate of the structuralist inflation model estimated for the period 96-97 quarter 1 to 2016-17 quarter 1 to forecast inflation up to 2021 quarter 1, which include this is the period of inflation targeting regime, and we are stopping at 221 because that is the latest data we are available when we started this thing. Though we use ONS estimates for forecasting, GMM IV estimates also give the same picture, and therefore so it is giving the same picture, therefore we are not representing it here. Now the results are given here. Now what you can see is that this actual inflation is in green and the pink is in predicted, and there is a fitted trend. This is essentially the polynomial trend. And what you can see is the vertical line 2016-17 quarter 2 is essentially shows the beginning of the inflation targeting. So the trend line is declining continuously. It shows that that is the one thing. And second thing is that the model predicts the model traces the trajectory of inflation, particularly during the inflation targeting regime, almost accurately. So now, since the permanent variable in this case is in our case is relative price, so we now look at what is happening to the relative price of agriculture good in India, and so first we capture the trajectory of its growth. We use the Parameswaran method to find out the different phases of growth rate of relative price. And this is a data-driven methodology. We have not used any priors, and we just allow the data to periodize itself. Now, first period is 96-97 quarter 1 to 2001, where the growth rate of relative price is 0. And now look at the 2002 to 2004-5, the growth rate is negative 0.5. So what we can see is that this growth rate is synchronized with the trajectory of inflation in India. For example, you can see that from 2000 to 2004-5 time, the inflation in India is at around 4%, near around 4%. So at that time, what is called this relative price is actually declining. Now from 2004-5 to 2010-11, what you can see is that the relative price is increasing at 0.93%. So that period you can also see that this is 2004-5 to 2010-11. 4.5 to 2010-11, what you can see is that the CPI inflation is increasing continuously increasing, and from there onwards you can see it's a declining. That you can also see here from 2011-12 to 2017-18, the relative price is increasing at 0.6-0.9 percentage point. At that point, what you can see is that up to around this, the relative price, the inflation, CPI inflation is also slightly higher than the 6% upper bound. And now what you can see is that 2017-18 to 2020-21 relative price is very low, and this is also the period the inflation rate is within the bound, that is within the bound set by the inflation targeting board. So now you can also see we also plot the growth rate of relative price and CPI inflation. What you can see is that there is a high level of co-movement between these two variables. All this implies that inflation in India is determined largely by the relative price movement of agriculture. Now coming to the second part, that is, this is the inflation, whether inflation targeting actually anchored inflation expectations. In theory, inflation targeting works via anchoring inflation expectations by the central bank. So So in this way, it has been claimed that inflation in India has been contained within the target range since 2016 because RBI successfully anchored the expectation of inflation. We investigate this claim. Next slides present 3 months ahead and 1 year ahead inflation expectations of households and actual inflation. RBI regularly conducts inflation expectation survey of households. They conducted in from 2000. I think they conducted from 2006-7 onwards, and RBI conducted in 18 major cities, and I think it's around 5,000 households. And the survey asked them what is the expected inflation for the next 3 months and for the next 1 year. So what from RBI database, we get the unit level data also from each household as well as for each city. And then RBI also presents the summary measures, the mean expected inflation for the next 3 months as well as for the next 1 year. What we are presenting here is the mean expected inflation for the 3 month ahead and 1 year ahead and actual inflation. So that is from 2006-7 quarter to 2020-21 quarter one. Now this, as usual, the vertical line indicates the beginning of the what is called the inflation targeting regime. Now what we can see is that yes, inflation that is expected inflation is not it was not there was no great increasing in inflation expectations after the inflation targeting regime. So though three month inflation expectation is slightly increasing, at the same time the actual inflation is declining. Then another thing is that another observation we can make is that inflation expectations, though stabilize, not increasing or not declining drastically from 2016, so the beginning of the inflation targeting. It reached that stage from around 2014-15 quarter one onwards after experiencing a drastic decline. And this is a period where there was no inflation targeting regime. Then another important point is that this is the objective of the RBI or central bank is to bring the inflation expectations bring to that bound. That is that bound of 4% to 6%. So by higher inflation expectations according to theory means that it leads to higher future inflation because the wage and cost will be indexed keeping these inflation expectations. But in Indian case, the inflation expectations is very high, is much above the upper bound, which is around 10%, around 10%. Yeah. Now we also tested whether inflation expectations, 3 month ahead inflation expectation has any role in determining inflation in India. Since inflation expectations has a role in the new Keynesian Phillips curve, we re-estimated the new NKPC using what is called the 3 month ahead inflation expectation. Why we are using 3 month ahead inflation expectation is that we are using the quarterly data. So whether next period's inflation is influenced by this period in expectation about the next period inflation. So that is why we use 3 month ahead inflation expectations. What we use as usual, ONS and GMM. What you can see is that a lagged inflation is significant as usual, but expected inflation is not significant at all, and in the GMMIB it has a negative sign. And another thing is that once we put inflation expectations into the picture, into the model, what is happening is that output gap is getting a completely unexpected significance, negatively significant. It should never happen. So this is so the model is not at all fitting to the data and as well as the theory. So these evidence suggests that inflation expectations is not inflation expectations have not played a role in determining the trajectory of inflation in India. That is the one thing. Second thing is that since inflation expectations is also at a higher level above the 6%, the upper bound, that is when we claim that that is RBI anchored inflation expectations is also not we cannot buy that argument. And there is an interview in Economic Times given by RBI Governor Shaktikant Das. He he's mentioned that their plan is to bring inflation expectation to the bound of 4 to 6 percentage points. Then, if that is happening, and then there is also an RBI study published in RBI bulletin. They explored that whether and then they said that some cities average inflation expectations are within the bound. Otherwise, I think it means that RBI's views also is that when they say that inflation expectations are anchored, it must be within that bound. Now I am concluding. I think I already took 45 minutes. In 2021, India completed 5 years of inflation targeting. Reviews have asserted the fact that inflation remaining within the mandated band is evidence of the success of inflation targeting. This paper argued that such an approach cannot exclude observational equivalence, that observed inflation may have been generated by a process unrelated to the model underlying inflation targeting. Accordingly, we investigated which of the two alternative models of inflation can account for Indian experience. It was found that New Keynesian Phillips curve, on which the central bank across the world base their inflation targeting, is not validated for Indian data, but the structuralist model of inflation based on relative price movement is. Further, it was also found that the structuralist model of inflation was tracing the path of inflation during the inflation targeting regime with a greater degree of accuracy. This implies that subdued inflation in India during the inflation targeting regime can be attributed to the behavior of commodity prices. So here now I stop here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parameswaran. Okay, so the floor is open. You can ask question one by one, or you can just write it in the chat box.
Can I ask?
Yeah,
Dr.
sure.
Yeah, nice, interesting analysis, Dr. Parameswaran and Chidambaran here. I was just curious. The oil price that you're speaking, is it the international oil price, or is it the domestic oil price? Which is the oil price that you're taking?
Yeah, this is the domestic oil price, because what we have did is that we have taken the data from the wholesale price index of oil. It is called mineral oils in the heading, because that is what, because I think the domestic price is this price reflects the international price movement also. And the thing is that what matters for the inflation in India is the domestic price of oil.
Yes. So my, of course, I don't understand much, but my understanding was that after 2014, when the prices of oil dropped in India, the government increased the excise duty and cornered a lot of, when the international oil prices are coming down, in India, oil prices remained the same, primarily because the excise duty was increased so that the government could increase its, could get in more taxes. And as a result of, so one point which I wanted to know, the oil price structure across the whole period that you're looking at is actually, varying. Like for 96, 97, we had the governments were actually giving a subsidy to the oil companies to keep the prices down at the petrol pump or at the respective taps. Whereas after post 2004, when the APM came in, the administered pricing mechanism, then it was mandated that it will be market prices, but that never happened. But it was in the UPA that finally they increased prices by 10 paise, 50 paise, and then the market prices were eventually reached. So the underlying structure of the oil prices domestically has also changed during the whole time period that you're looking. So I'm not sure whether that will have an effect, because if you're talking about the petrol pump price now or the fuel price now as faced by the consumer, and if assuming that inflation expectations are, are affected by that, the pump price now, today, as the consumer says, it cannot be compared with the pump price say 15 years back when the government was shielding it through some other mechanisms. So my understanding, my only point is how are you accounting for this underlying structure in the oil prices within the domestic market in your model?
Can I answer this now, Chandra?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. See, we are not looking at how oil price how oil price is generated, how price is generated in the economy. Oil price is increase in the oil price is contributing to the cost of production and thereby to inflation. So what we did is that we have taken the wholesale price index of mineral oils. They include this petroleum, all these things. So I think that includes all these excise duties, all this, because it is the wholesale price index, which means that the companies are paying the what is called the excise duty. So the variable which we have taken incorporate all these changes in terms of the price. So, and I think the oil price structure as such, I think it's not relevant here. Similarly, the same kind of things can happen in other areas also, because of the change in the market structure, the way that price is determined may change. It can have a negative or positive impact on inflation. But we have taken the final price of the commodity.
Anyone else? Any other question? Dr. Parameswaran, I just have one point.
Yeah.
That since you are taking you have data for 5 years, and uh, and from these 5 years, 2 years were affected by pandemic. So it is just a point. So it may not be, I mean, the data that you have to understand the whether it has actually anchored inflation or not, that may not be sufficient, in the sense because during pandemic there should be some kind of downward pressure on inflation. This is just one point. I don't know whether it is true or not. And just another question, that in there are many countries which has adopted this inflation targeting, and many developing and countries are also there in that list. So do you know any other paper which tries to analyze whether this inflation targeting actually anchors inflation in developing countries, in any other country, whether it is there or not? Do you have any idea?
Okay. Regarding the first comment, that is, we have the evaluate inflation targeting started from 2016-17 quarter two, I think so, from August onwards, officially. And then our data is ending on 2021 quarter one, I think so. And yeah, this pandemic related lockdown started in March 2020 March. So we have only one quarter or something for that during the pandemic period. But I think also at that time also it is fitting well. Otherwise, it is a pre-pandemic period data. That is the one thing. Yeah, regarding the second thing, there are many countries, developed countries also adopted inflation targeting, and some countries moved. I think New Zealand or some, I'm not remembering, moved out of this later. But one thing is that here I have gone through some of the literature, and also whether it also depends upon to what extent. First thing is, success of the inflation targeting depends upon the credibility of the credibility of the central bank. Credibility means that to what extent the central bank can anchor, can control inflation. Here, another issue is that there is also one. I missed that point. When inflation expectations reduced after the introduction of the inflation targeting, that can, when you remove this NKPC from the picture, and it can also be due to the fact that the agents may be using the structuralist model, and if they are using the structuralist model, and they say that they see that the agriculture price, the food prices are declining, and on that basis they are expecting a lower inflation. Then so we don't know how inflation expectations are determined. It can also be due to this kind of mechanism. So then regarding the other countries' case, India, look at the CPI, Consumer Price Index, around 54% of the weight is given to what is called food and beverages, which is mainly agricultural products, on which the RBI does not have much control. So the RBI's ability to control the headline inflation is also not very high, and if the agents believe that we are not feeling confident about the RBI ability, then that is by communicating the fact that the RBI central bank is committed to inflation targeting, that then may not take it seriously. So,
Okay.
yeah, so it varies from countries to countries. So ability of the central bank to control inflation. For example, in US case, the share of the food and beverages is only 8%. So 8% means that as a large increase in food price may not have a significant impact on inflation. But their inflation is increasing now.
Yeah, that's why I was just asking about whether any such study which is relevant for any developing countries or not.
Sir?
Yes.
And this is Irfan here. Can I ask?
Yeah, please.
Sir, since you said like RBI cannot control inflation without controlling agriculture prices, but we know on the other hand RBI cannot control agriculture prices. So what according to you is then reducing inflation in India? Like when you have shown even the expectation graph and the actual inflation graph, wherein the expectations as well as the inflation has reduced from 2013-14 onwards. Could it be because of the governorship, since we saw in 2013-14 and in 2013 September when Raghuram Rajan took over from D. Subbarao, there was a change in the policy making. The Urjit Patel committee report also was approved like during that time. The report, the financial sector report by Raghuram Rajan also indicated in 2009 that RBI should go for inflation targeting. So wasn't the seeds of inflation targeting sowed in 2013-14 onwards? And if we go with that, then we can see a clear shift in the inflation. Like there is a downward spike in the inflation from that period onwards. So if that is not the case, like then what explains that the 2013-14 shift? It doesn't monetary policy has a role in that? So one is this question, if you can please explain it a bit. And so second thing, when you were talking about relative price model, so I was a bit confused when you said theta. Is the theta the relative prices of agriculture goods, or is it the price between agriculture and industrial goods. So can you please explain these two things?
I start with the last one. The relative price is the ratio of agriculture price to industrial price. So ratio of agriculture price to industrial price. The way to derive is you use the national account statistics and derive the implicit deflator and take the ratio.
Sir, then I have a follow-up question. Can I ask that?
Yeah.
Sir, then if theta is the relative price of agriculture by industrial prices,
Yeah.
so in case the industrial prices fall, then the relative prices will increase, and then inflation in your model should increase. But then, sir, why should inflation increase if industrial prices are falling, like according to the theta? And this I didn't understand. And the RBI, like the Guru Ram Rajan, is it like something to do with the RBI governorship, or is it something?
Now coming to the I will second question, whether according to this paper, when you see this paper, the trajectory is explained in terms of the relative price movement. Now coming to the RBI governor change all these things, I think this inflation targeting idea has been there for some time. It was earlier they tried to the government of India tried to introduce with the Subarao.
Yes, sir.
When you read that what is called this Pooja Mahara's book on lost decade, there is an interview with the reported an interview with the Subbarao as well as Raghuram Rajan. Subbarao was against introducing inflation targeting because his argument is that a larger part of the CPI contains food and beverages, so RBI has no control over them. So there is no point in committing into a target, and that will actually erode the credibility of the RBI. When and the same question was that Pooja Mahara asked to Raghuram Rajan, he said that yes, we don't have a control over inflation because of this thing, but we can by anchoring inflation expectations, we can that is called reduce its we can eliminate its propagation to the propagation. So in that terms, that is increase in the commodity prices are only transitory. But here the issue is, once the food prices increases, it is also only a transitory effect in the. That is why in the NKPC, the food price or these kind of things have only a transitory effect, because a transitory effect in the sense that I think in a general equilibrium context, when you have a disequilibrium in one, the aggregate what is called excess supply is zero. So that disequilibrium in one excess supply, positive excess supply in one market is offset by negative excess supply in other markets. That is so aggregate, there won't be any effect in the. That is the one thing. Second thing is that when relative price of one commodity is increasing, the consumers will reduce the consumption of that, and therefore its price will decline, as well as what is called its output will also respond to the increased price. So that is the underlying logic of this transitory effect. But when it comes to the structuralist model, you have a food and non-food. These are not substitutable. So that transitory effect will not be, it can get into the core inflation also, if there is a food price inflation. So that difference is there. So I think I answered why governorship, why the Raghuram Rajan time, why he argued for what is called this inflation targeting, because he believed it can be this propagation can be controlled by committing to a particular level of inflation.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other question? Please.
I just wanted to know regarding the anchoring effect.
It is not very clear.
Am I audible now, sir?
Yeah, audible.
I just wanted to know if there was any comparative, like, I mean, I think the for anchoring effect was tested for the entire period as a whole, but I wanted to know whether it was tested like before inflation targeting regime and after inflation targeting regime, like whether there was any anchoring effect or not. Just wanted to understand that.
No, in the paper, what we did is that we first plotted the inflation expectations, and we found that inflation expectations are far above the upper limit. So it implies that RBI could not bring inflation expectations into that band. Then the second thing we did is that whether inflation expectations has any role in determining inflation in India. For that we used a regression model, this model, and this is for the entire period for which the inflation expectation data were available from 2006-7 to 2021 Q1.
So does it, like, I mean, since the expectations do not actually impact the inflation as such, can't it be claimed that the uh, the, the expectations, like, I mean, have been anchored in the sense that the expectations do not affect the inflation in the next period?
Abhinav, can you make it more clear? What is the question?
If the expectations actually affect the inflation in the next period, then the inflation expectation has not been anchored, in the sense the expectations are affecting the inflation in the next period. So if it is not affecting, can it be claimed that the inflation expectation has actually been anchored? Because, like, if it is not affecting, then it means like it is remaining stable and it's not affecting the inflation in the next period.
These are two questions of two parts: whether inflation expectations have been anchored, and whether inflation expectations have been affecting inflation. Now, to my understanding, anchoring inflation expectations means that RBI could moderate their inflation households or agents inflation expectations to the level which is targeted by it. But that did not happen. That is the case. Then the second question is whether inflation expectations have any impact on inflation. This is now it is a highly contested issue. For example, Hurt paper also giving lot of cases, empirical evidences where expectations have any role, because here the expectations have a role means that in the wage bargaining, laborers are expecting this is the 10% is the rate of expected inflation for the next period. So they incorporate that expectation into their wage contract. So wage will increase and therefore the cost will increase. So nowadays, the argument is nowadays wage contract is not happening like that. So that is all the empirical. They are citing there are some empirical evidences which is wage contract. I don't know wage contract is happening here like that in India. Then another thing is that if a large part, particularly in the formal sector, for example, in the government sector, it is not the expected expectation matters, but it's the actual inflation. If the CPI is increasing by certain points, you will get a DA. That is how wage is indexed. But now wage indexation with the consumer price index is, I don't know, maybe in formal sector it may be there, but in large informal sector we don't know. Then another thing is that, yeah, I also want to mention that this thing, when it comes to the whether RBI's communication has an impact on inflation, agents' inflation expectation, that is also doubtful. For example, when RBI started its inflation expectation survey in 2006-7, they have in the questionnaire they have a question: are you aware of the RBI's policies towards inflation control? I think only the response, yes, response is very, very around 10%. I'm not remembering that number at any number exactly. It is very low. That itself means that when agents are not aware of the RBI's policies, but later in the later round they removed this question from the questionnaire. So we don't know whether agents are aware of the RBI policy of inflation targeting or not. So all these kind of issues are there.
Any other question, comment? Okay, Dr. Parameswaran. So we can conclude the webinar, and thank you very much for the presentation. It was really a very
Thank
interesting
you.
work. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.